The sun was setting over the harbor of St. Peter Port on June 28, 1940, when the sound of engines began to thump through the air. It wasn't the familiar comforting roar of the RAF. These were Heinkel bombers. Their twin engines created a syncopated rhythm that felt heavy in the chest. The people of Guernsey didn't run at first. They watched. They watched as planes dropped their payloads on the lines of lorries waiting at the docks, thinking they were military transports. They were actually filled with tomatoes, the island's main export, ready for shipment to the mainland. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of burning fruit and cordite. Dozens were killed in those few minutes, their bodies lying among the shattered crates of produce, and then a terrifying silence fell. The British government had secretly declared the islands an open town, withdrawing all military protection to save the civilian population from a massacre. But they hadn't told the Germans, and they hadn't told the islanders. The British had left. The Nazis were coming, and for the next 5 years, a piece of Britain would belong to Adolf Hitler. Welcome to World War II Obscura. Imagine a world where your local policeman is still wearing his British helmet, but he's saluting a man in a Hugo Boss-designed Wehrmacht uniform. Imagine the local grocery store selling its last tins of biscuits to German soldiers who pay in occupation marks. This was the reality for over 60,000 British citizens on the islands of Jersey, Guernsey, Sark, and Alderney. For years, the story of the Channel Islands was whispered about in hushed tones. It was an uncomfortable truth, the swastika flying over British soil. British officials signing laws dictated by Nazi commanders, and British neighbors turning on one another. The occupation was initially designed by Hitler to be a model occupation. He wanted to show the world, and especially the British mainland, how well they would be treated if they just surrendered. But as the war dragged on, the mask of the gentlemanly German soldier began to slip, revealing a much darker, much more familiar face of the Third Reich. The actual arrival of the Germans was almost anticlimactic. In Guernsey, a single pilot named Hauptmann Liebe Peteritz landed his plane at the airport. He climbed out, pistol drawn, expecting a hail of bullets. Instead, he found a deserted airfield. He walked into the terminal and was met by a lone, bewildered official who informed him that the island was undefeated. He reportedly climbed back into his plane, flew to France to get reinforcements, and returned to conquer the island. Within days, the streets of St. Helier and St. Peter Port were filled with the sound of jackboots. But at first, the soldiers were remarkably polite. They'd been given strict orders to behave. They bought up all the luxury goods the islanders had left, silk stockings, chocolates, perfumes, and sent them back to their wives in Germany. They called the islands the land of milk and honey. For the soldiers, it was a dream posting. For the islanders, it was a waking nightmare cloaked in civility. By 1941, the honeymoon period was over. The Germans began to assert control over the most basic elements of life. The first thing they took was the news. All radios were ordered to be handed in. To a British citizen in 1941, the BBC was more than just a radio station. It was a lifeline. It was the only way to know if London was still standing or if the war was being won. Losing the radio meant total isolation. But the islanders didn't just give up. In the dead of night, men and women built crystal sets hidden inside tobacco tins or tucked away behind the false walls of their cellars. They would gather in groups of 2 or 3, huddling around a tiny earpiece or speaker to hear the faint crackling pips of the BBC. It was a hanging offense to be caught with a radio, yet thousands of people risked the gallows every night just to hear the voice of London. Their defiance soon took a more visible form, the V for Victory campaign. It started as a simple bit of graffiti, a V chalked onto a wall, but it spread like a virus. The V appeared on the backs of German lorries, on the doors of the Kommandantur, even on the boots of sleeping soldiers. The Germans were infuriated. They tried to counter it with a bizarre piece of psychological theater. Instead of scrubbing the V's away, they had decided to adopt them. They began hanging massive banners with the letter V on them, claiming it stood for Victoria, a German word for victory. They even put a giant V on the side of the Guernsey Parliament building. For a few months, the islands were a surreal landscape of V symbols, with both the occupiers and the occupied claiming the same letter for entirely different reasons. But everyone knew what it really meant. It was a silent scream of resistance. Resistance had a terrible price. In 1942, a woman named Louisa Gold lived in the parish of St. Owen on Jersey. She was a widow who ran a small grocery shop. She had already lost one son in the war, killed in action in the Navy, when a group of Russian slave laborers, men captured on the Eastern Front and brought to the islands to build fortifications, escaped from their camp. One of them, a young man named Fyodor, found his way to Louisa's door. She didn't see an enemy. She didn't see a subhuman, as the Nazi propaganda called him. She saw a boy who reminded her of her son. She took him in. She called him Bill. For nearly 2 years, Louisa hid Bill in her home. She taught him English. The neighbors knew about him. They had to know. In a small island community, secrets are hard to keep. But for a long time, they kept her secret. Bill became part of the family. But as the war turned against Germany, the atmosphere on the island grew paranoid. Rations were vanishing. People were hungry, and hunger does strange things to the human soul. In 1944, an anonymous letter was sent to the German authorities. Someone had betrayed Louisa. Someone had told about Bill. When the Gestapo arrived at her shop, they found a piece of evidence Louisa had forgotten to hide, a Russian-English dictionary. She was arrested along with her brother and a friend who had helped. During her trial, she remained defiant. She didn't care about their laws. She only cared about the boy she had saved. Louisa Gold was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She died in the gas chambers in February 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. Bill, the young Russian, survived the war, hidden by other islanders until the end. Louisa's story is a haunting reminder that even on British soil, the Holocaust was not a distant rumor. It was a physical reality. Nowhere was that reality more horrific than on the island of Alderney. Most of the civilian population of Alderney had been evacuated before the Germans arrived, leaving the island a blank canvas for the Nazi war machine. They turned it into a fortress. They built 2 concentration camps there, Lager Norderney and Lager Sylt. The latter was eventually taken over by the SS. These were the only SS concentration camps on British soil. Thousands of slave laborers, Russians, Poles, Jews, and North Africans were brought to build the massive concrete bunkers that still scar the landscape today. The conditions were beyond comprehension. The workers, known as OT workers after Organization Todt, were fed a diet of watery soup and a few ounces of sawdust-filled bread. They worked 12-hour shifts in the freezing wind, hauling bags of cement until their lungs gave out. If they stumbled, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were often executed or simply left to die in the mud. The locals on the neighboring islands could see the smoke rising from the camps. They could hear the screams across the water. British citizens were living just miles away from a miniature Auschwitz. The Germans tried to hide the scale of the atrocities, but after the war, mass graves were found. The precise number of people who died on Alderney is still a matter of heated debate, but the horror of it remains a stain on the history of the British Isles. As the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the islanders' hearts leapt. They could see the flashes of the big guns along the French coast. They could see the Allied planes filling the skies. They thought their liberation was only days away, but they were wrong. The Allies decided to bypass the Channel Islands. They were too well fortified, and the cost of invasion was deemed to be too high. Churchill's cabinet decided on a different strategy. Let them rot. The islands were cut off. No more supplies came from France. The Germans there were also trapped, began to seize every scrap of food left. By the winter of 1944 and 1945, it became known as the Great Hunger. This wasn't just a shortage, it was starvation. People were reduced to eating ersatz food made of unimaginable ingredients. Coffee was made from roasted acorns or ground sugar beet. Tobacco was made from dried bramble leaves. People hunted for limpets on the rocks, even though they were tough as rubber and offered little nutrition. Pets began to disappear. Horses were slaughtered. The elderly began to die of malnutrition in their beds. In the middle of this desperation, the local governments made a final pleading appeal to the Red Cross. The Germans, realizing they were sitting on a ticking time bomb of a starving population, allowed a ship through. On December 30th, 1944, a Swedish ship named the Vega appeared on the horizon. It was carrying Red Cross parcels, the Canadian parcels as they became known. The sight of that ship is something survivors still talk about with tears in their eyes. They didn't just see food, they saw hope. Inside those parcels were things they hadn't seen in years: real chocolate, real coffee, tinned meat, and vitamins. For many, the Vega was the only reason they survived to see the spring. Liberation finally came on May 9, 1945, one day after the war ended in Europe. The British destroyer HMS Bulldog arrived in St. Peter Port. The scene was chaotic. German soldiers, still armed, stood on the piers as British sailors jumped ashore. The islanders went wild. They ripped down the swastikas. They hoisted the Union Jack. They hugged their soldiers until their ribs ached, but the joy was tempered by a dark undercurrent. The Channel Island girls, women who had been socializing or sleeping with German soldiers, were rounded up. In some cases, their hair was shorn bald in the streets. Collaborators were pointed out. The years of living in such close proximity to the enemy had left deep scars that wouldn't heal for decades. The occupation of the Channel Islands is a story that challenges our neatly packaged view of World War II. It's a story where the lines between hero and villain are often blurred by the simple, desperate need to stay alive. It's a story of British policemen enforcing Nazi curfews, but also of British grandmothers dying in gas chambers for the sake of a stranger. It reminds us that the British spirit wasn't just about Spitfires and Churchillian speeches. It was about the quiet, terrifying endurance of people who had no weapons, but their will to remain themselves. This chapter of World War II history shows us that no one is immune. The horror of the 1940s didn't just happen over there in some far-off land. It happened in English-speaking towns with English-speaking postmen and English-speaking shopkeepers. It happened on the streets where people still drive on the left and drink tea at 4 o'clock. It serves as a permanent warning. The veneer of civilization is thinner than we think, and the choices we make when the lights go out define who we truly are. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.